Hi everyone, Jason Tripp here. Welcome to Tripp Advisor. It's Thursday, so it's time again for another Theology Thursday conversation. Thanks for taking time to join me. Today, we're going to continue on in our conversation using the big sort of analogy, the big metaphor we've been using the last few weeks of building a house and constructing a house, and how house construction is quite analogous to both deconstructing and reconstructing a theological framework, a theological worldview, faith formation. The last couple of weeks, we've literally and metaphorically been laying the foundation for this house building project. We've talked previously about the tools, healthy tools in our toolbox, using scripture and reason and experience and tradition to help guide us, looking at things through the lens of Jesus, who in the Christian tradition shows us both what God is like and what it means to be truly human. The last 2 weeks, we talked about the two ingredients that, in my personal opinion, we need to mix together to make that firm foundation upon which everything else is built upon. Those two ingredients being, one, God is love, and two, God is like Jesus. And we've talked about those in recent weeks. If you missed those videos, I encourage you to check those ones out, because they really are foundational, and every future conversation will be built upon those two ingredients that form this foundation. Well, if those two ingredients make the foundation, and each sort of specific theological topic are like the rooms in the house, today I want to talk a little bit about the framework. The framework within all of those rooms are built upon those two foundations. And before I get into the specifics today, I want to tell you a little story about my past and my own journey. I went to a Bible college, a seminary called Tyndale in southern Ontario in the early 2000s. And it was a very sort of formative time. It was a time where I was going through some deconstruction and just starting to kind of reconstruct things and put on sort of a different lens through which I viewed everything in my faith formation and worldview, with Jesus sort of at the center, as we've been talking about. And I was sitting in a particular class. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a systematic theology class, and the professor was giving a talk. It was near the end of the semester, and he was giving a talk on the sovereignty of God and ways of understanding God's providence. And I grew up, in my mind, God was very hands-on. God was sort of often the ones who was pulling the strings. I mean, we did have a certain amount of freedom, I understood, but God could and did often sort of intervene and unilaterally control or coerce things for God's good and sometimes often mysterious purposes. But on this particular day, in this particular class, the professor was sort of giving me a different perspective, a perspective that deep down I was kind of intuiting was good and true and beautiful, but wasn't able to sort of articulate it. And he was able to do so. And he left the class giving us a book recommendation. And it's this little book here I'm holding in my hands called God of the Possible, a biblical introduction to what he called the open view of God. Well, rather than going home after that class, as I typically would do, I went directly to the library. I picked up this book my professor had recommended that day, and I read all 170 odd pages in one sitting. And I remember being so captivated by the content of this book, this picture of God and how God relates to the world, taken right from Scripture. A lot of what was written here are things that I had intuited to be true, but I really wasn't given the means to sort of articulate what I had surmised to be true. And so that was sort of a light bulb moment, one of many light bulb moments in that time between now and then that have helped me sort of rebuild my theological house, and serving as the framework, this idea that God is utterly relational. And so today I want to talk about what is known as sort of a big theological tent under which I and many others across denominations and Christian traditions sort of operate and do their theological building. And it's called Open and Relational Theology. So I just want to sort of dip our toes, and I want to, again, I've always wanted to be honest and forthright with where I'm coming from, so when we get to certain topics, you'll understand it's coming from, oh yes, the belief that God is love, God looks like Jesus, and sort of this open and relational theological understanding that I espouse. So I want to show a brief video. This video was put together by Thomas J. Ord. He's the director of the recently launched Center for Open and Relational Theology. And it kind of gives the broad strokes of what open and relational theology is, what I was sort of reading about in this book and many others. And then I'll make a few brief comments to unpack a little bit what's in this video. So that's basically a broad strokes, in a nutshell, sort of basic introduction to what we can call open and relational theology. And as we saw in that video, basically two premises. One, God is relational. And two, God and creation move together into an open future together. And it is true. I've encountered a growing number of people that are attracted, and it's interesting. It's not one person group or people group or one segment of the Christian faith, but it cuts across sort of all ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, denominational divides. There are people that sort of espouse this open and relational theological view across the board, which I find very fascinating and interesting. And as someone who loves interacting with people that are outside of my specific tribe, church, and denomination, that's attractive to me. And so there is sort of a growing number of people attracted to this way of thinking. This idea that God is relational, I think if you asked any follower of Jesus, any Christian, they would say, yeah, God is relational. But open and relational theology, I think, takes very seriously, starting with those two foundational premises. God is love, and we get our picture of who God is and how God operates primarily in the life and the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We take those two principles very seriously to help sort of build this sort of framework in which we do all theology and interact with all theological beliefs. The fact that God gives and receives from creation. Any relationship is two-way. And I think sometimes when we talk about God or we think about God, we start from a place of darkness. We start from a place of sort of utter mystery. And we can say a couple things about God, but mostly God is mysterious. I think it's healthy to start with what we do know, what God has given to us. Primarily, He's given us the revelation of Jesus, the one who says, I only say what I see my Father doing. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. I am the way, the truth, and life. All of those statements from Jesus point us to the fact that Jesus is sort of the self-revelation of God. As I've heard it said, Jesus is perfect theology. Jesus is what God has to say. So we start with Jesus. And in the life of Jesus and how Jesus related to others, we see that God is not this emotionless being. God is not utterly unchangeable in all ways, shapes, and forms. God is not, as theologians have thought throughout history, God is not impassible. And that word simply means that God is incapable of changing or having any emotions that can affect or change God in any aspect. And certainly when it comes to us believing God is love, God is unchanging in His core attributes. But I find it very difficult to read Scripture, and certainly to view the life of Jesus, and to come to the conclusion that God is fully and utterly impassible, that God is emotionless. Throughout the entire Old and New Testament, we read God literally relating to creation, not void of emotions, but it's a give and take relationship. We see God who is angry, God is saddened, God is full of joy, God even has regrets, we read in Scripture. It seems quite clear, to me at least, that God does indeed suffer with us and God feels our pain. As Jurgen Moltmann says in his famous book, The Crucified God, a God who cannot suffer is poorer than any human. For a God who is incapable of suffering is a being who cannot be involved. Suffering and injustice do not affect him. And because he is so completely insensitive, he cannot be affected or shaken by anything. He cannot weep, for he has no tears. But the one who cannot suffer cannot love either. So he is also a loveless being. We read also in Scripture that the choices and the prayers of the people not only make a difference in creation, but also have an impact and an influence to a certain degree on God. Our choices really do make a difference to God. And just like any interpersonal human relationship, it makes sense that if we are created, as Scripture says, in the image and the likeness of God, then how we relate to each other gives us a glimpse of how we can and should relate to God and how God relates to us. God gives, but also God receives love. We have the gift of faith given by God, but even God has some hope, some trust, some faith in us, his creation. And so we should love God, we should love others, and we should love all of creation. This is the first sort of tenet of open and relational theology. God is relational in more ways like we are relational with one another than we sometimes give credit to God. God is not distant. God is not emotionless. God is not, to echo the phrase from Aristotle, God is not the unmoved mover, but perhaps God is the most moved mover. God is moved by us. Certainly God was moved to take on flesh and dwell among us. Throughout Scripture, in the New Testament life of Jesus, we see that Jesus was often moved with compassion into situations. Jesus wept. Jesus got frustrated. Jesus got discouraged. These are all human emotions, but I believe God is not utterly emotionless as well. These are also a reflection of the God who is utterly relational. Open and relational theologian Clark Pinnock has actually written a book called The Most Moved Mover, and he writes these words in a lecture he gave on open and relational theology a few years back. He says, "Open and relational theologies envision a situation where there is genuine interaction between God and his creations, where God enters into reciprocal give and take relationships with his creations, and where God responds to what his creations do. In all this, God willingly, sometimes necessarily, accepts a degree of conditionality and risk-taking." And this is good news. This is good news. Secondly, the second major tenet, as we saw in this little video here, of open and relational theology says that God and creation move into an open future. And I believe this is good news as well. The sort of theological framework I grew up with and was given was that we have all been sort of predetermined or predestined to make certain choices. God has pre-programmed some things into our hearts, into our lives, and so life was sort of one big blueprint. Of course, that begs the question, well, what's the point of it all if we've all been sort of pre-programmed how to think, how to pray, how to act? Of course, we talked about having free will, but God was always able to revoke that or to coerce us in different directions. Open and relational theology, I think, also, because Scripture seems to imply this, as well as our reason and our experiences, says that God relates to us moment by moment as together we move into this open future. God does not predetermine life. We are not predestined. We have been given genuine freedom. We've been given choice moment by moment. This is reasonable. This is how we experience life. We are constantly bombarded with choices. Those choices are very real. They're not fabricated choices. We've not been fated or destined towards certain destinies per se, but we have been given choices, individual choices and collective choices. And the God who is utterly relational is involved with us as we relate to God and others to make healthy choices, choices that help love to flourish in our lives, in our communities, in the world at large. Certainly God has plans, God has a will, God has purposes, but not even God knows for certain how things will turn out. And so we can say that, as all Christians have throughout history, that God is all-knowing, God is omniscient. Open and relational theologians do not deny the omniscience of God. We simply say that God knows everything that is possible to know. And because the future does not yet exist, there's really nothing to know, both from our perspective and God's perspective. This idea that God is sort of outside of time is not something that is clearly stated in Scripture. It's something that is more infused, I believe, from sort of Greek thinking and from Aristotle and others that has made their way into the thinking of the church throughout history. We have been given genuine freedom. God has plans. God is influencing and being influenced, but God is never coercing or unilaterally controlling. God is not the divine micromanager or the puppet master in the sky, nor is God an absentee landlord, but God is present and active, but working with, rather than working over or calling down instructions or sending down judgments from afar. Open and relational theology for me, like the video implies, it does fit. It fits with a lot of how we think, or at least how I think. It fits with the main theme, sort of the flow of the grand story of Scripture. And you can certainly pull a verse here and a verse there to try and argue otherwise, but I think taken as a whole, the grand story of Scripture implies that God is utterly relational, and God is moving, God is working with those God has created and has loved, and toward God's good purposes, but not in a way that is controlling or coercing, but in a way that is loving and persuading through love. It also, as the video suggests, it connects with theories in the world of science and the social sciences and natural sciences. As we get into the world of biology and microbiology, we see that even subatomic particles, they don't seem to be pre-programmed or predestined, but even in the world of science, we're seeing that randomness and freedom is a reality not only at the human level, but even at the micro level. And that seems to fit with this framework of open and relational theology, that God is relational but not controlling. And creation, even at a smaller sort of level, subhuman level, is free. And of course, if we look at the world of arts, we look at the world of innovators and arts, we see this desire towards creating beauty and the freedom, whether it's in dance or music or film. And I think when we take all of these areas of life together, we take the broad witness of Scripture together, we take our interpersonal human relationships together, yes, at the end of the day, there will be some mysteries. And as we've talked about in recent weeks, faith is not being certain about everything we believe or even anything we believe. But it's a question of what is most plausible, what is most probable. And to me, it seems quite plausible, this understanding that God is relational and that God and creation together move into an open future together. This has really helped me since that day in the library after class reading that book in one sitting. That's really helped me understand Scripture, the grand story of Scripture. It's really helped me actually understand one of the biggest problems, and we'll talk about this down the road, the problem of evil. How can a all-loving and all-powerful God coexist with so much evil in the world? I believe open and relational theology gives a reasonable answer, an answer that fits with Scripture, and an answer that fits with my lived experience. It also gives me freedom to both interact in the world of faith, but also in the world of science, not to see faith and science as polar opposite or bumping up against each other. This is very important, especially today as we go through this pandemic together, that I can put my faith in God, but I also put my faith in health professionals and scientists, those in which God has created and given wisdom to help find a cure and to tell us more about the nature of this virus and other things in the natural world. And so at the end of the day, these are some of the reasons that I and a growing number of people are sort of functioning under this big tent we call open and relational theology. I'll put some links in the notes for today's video if you want to explore this a little further, and certainly we'll come back and we'll unpack some of this a little more down the road. But this today is just a broad stroke sort of nutshell of what open and relational theology is, and I believe it's a good framework built upon those two foundational truths: God is love and God looks like Jesus. Once again, thank you for taking time on this Thursday to hang out with me for a few minutes. As always, you are welcome to like this video. You can share it if you think others would glean something from today's video or any of the other videos I produced here at Tripp Advisor. You can subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and be notified whenever I release a new video. And be reminded, not only do I do videos on Thursdays related to theology, but I also every Tuesday I release Tabletop Tuesday board game tutorials. And every Friday, speaking of art, I release a film review or something related to the world of cinema and film every Friday. And so I'm Jason Tripp. This is Tripp Advisor. Thank you as always for being with me, and I trust you have a great day. I'll see you again next week.